Okay, one thing that I want to mention to you, there's one thing that is the most distinctive and set apart about Jacob Lake is the white-tailed squirrel. For many, many years, and we don't know how many decades, the white-tailed squirrel that is found on the Kaibab here at Jacob Lake is probably the most distinctive thing about Jacob Lake if you were to single out one thing. This is the only place that it's found in the world, except that they have transplanted a few of them over to Mount Trumbull. And the last time I was at Mount Trumbull, when we had my great-grandfather's marker placed there, I saw a couple of whitetails there. To my knowledge, no other place in the world, at least for many years, I know that this was the only place that the white-tailed squirrel lived. I can't speak for the last 50 years, or maybe there is other places, but to my knowledge, it's a beautiful little squirrel. The body of the squirrel is black. It's really a very deep, deep brown, but it looks black. And the tail is about as large as the body of the squirrel. And it's fluffy white, long hair, fluffy white hair. And it's a beautiful little animal that when it runs, it looks like there's two parts to it. There's the white fluffy tail and the black body. But this is the only place, to my knowledge, that the white-tailed squirrel is recognized or seen. It used to be, when I was just a kid here, that people came here from all over the world with the idea in mind of seeing the white-tailed squirrel. And we usually could show them to them. They were plentiful in those days. At certain periods, depending on the weather and depending on dryness and things of that nature, there have been times when it became nearly extinct here, when the fires would go through and wipe out many of them. Sometimes it took them a few years to come back, but they're fairly plentiful right now, because I've seen a half a dozen of them since we've been here today. But they're a distinctive item of the Kaibab Forest. Jacob Lake is the center of where people come to see the white-tailed squirrel. I'm going to name some of the people that I remember worked here after I came when I was 12 years old, back in 1942. As I mentioned, Uncle Billy, who ran the horses, was here at that time. He was an old cowboy that had bow legs. I can remember he couldn't touch his knees together if he had to. If you walked behind him, you could always see what was ahead of him just by looking between his legs as he walked. He was, and as I mentioned other times, he was the grandson of Jacob Hamblin, for whom Jacob Lake was named. Wonderful guy, had a bar handle mustache, and used to wear a big cowboy hat, cowboy boots, chaps, spurs. He used to always wearing spurs. He was quite a spectacle for the tourists And when he had his horses tied up over behind the old service station, of course, people always wanted to go over and pet the horses. And lots of them would want to take rides. And Uncle Billy would take them all over the mountain, different places, depending on how much time they wanted to pay for. And I had my horse Chief here, and they usually always wanted to ride Chief. A lot of them wanted to ride Chief because he was the prettiest horse there. He was black and white, you know. But Uncle Billy was a fixture here. He's the one that one time a tourist asked him, "What color uniform does the cattle guard wear?" Because they'd see signs along the highway, cattle guard, and they wondered what kind of, how do I identify a cattle guard? What kind of uniform do they wear? Well, cattle guard, to those who know, is just a matter of ribs of steel across the road that keeps cattle from going through the fence. It's fenced outside of the road, it's fenced all along the property, but when it gets to the road, you can't have a fence there, so you put a cattle guard there. And it's about anywhere from 6 to 8 strips of like a railroad rail running parallel, and when you drive over with the car, it goes, and so you know you crossed a cattle guard. But they're all marked on the highway with a sign. People didn't realize they were going across a cattle guard when their tires had a vibration in them. So somebody asked him, and he said, well, most of them are green, and most of them were all painted green. I don't think he ever told them that it was what they ran over. Anyway, interesting story. Had another one ask him, where do you take the elevator down into the Grand Canyon on the North Rim? And he said, well, you go right out to the edge of Bright Angel Point, and you just step out, and you take the elevator express straight down 5,000 feet. But it only goes one way. And people actually had no knowledge of the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is anywhere from 15 to, I guess, 25, maybe 50 feet wide in some places. And it's over 5,000 feet deep. And the North Rim is 1,300 feet higher than the South Rim. So you get a better view of the Grand Canyon from the North Rim than you do from the South Rim. There's no road across it because you can't put a road across 40 or 50 miles of washed out river bottoms that has taken centuries and centuries and millions of years to create. Uncle Billy was a fixture here at that time until he died 10 years or so later. Then some of the other interesting people that had worked here during the time that I worked here over the 6-year period, we had Jim Glover. Jim Glover was the cook, and he was a great asset to Jacob Lake. He worked all year long, oftentimes, cooking into the winter, even when we had very few people come here. He was here to cook and open up. He also worked on the cattle ranch that we had down in House Rock Valley, and was a cowboy when we'd have cattle roundups and dehorning and so on. So he's from Kanab, his family's still there in Kanab. When we were talking about the last fire that we had here at Jacob Lake, and Melinda mentioned the Glover family was very nice and very helpful in arranging for places for the students to stay. The Glover family were descendants of Jim Glover, who had been a part of Jacob Lake many, many years. I think Jim's probably dead by now, but his family is still a prominent family. And here they are still helping Jacob Lake out 60 years later. So Jim Glover was a very important person that spent many years, gave a lot of his life to Jacob Lake Inn. I mentioned that we had two people from the Utah State Hospital that my Uncle Willie sent down. He was a doctor, as we mentioned, and he was in charge of a lot of the inmates there. And he thought that he had a couple of people that would work out good down here. And he sent down Jim, who was a gummer. He didn't have any teeth. And Jane, who was about 6 inches taller than Jim, and she was a big, buxom gal that was always in the know of what was going on. Those two used to fight a lot back and forth with each other. Then some of the family members that worked here, we had Phyllis Nixon, who was Uncle Willie's daughter. She worked there about 2 summers while I was here. We had Richard Nixon, who was my cousin, that worked here at least 1 summer, maybe 2. We had a lot of Bowmans on Uncle Harold's side. We had Keith Bowman, who fell off the water tower and landed on his feet instead of his head, about a 20-foot fall. And after that, Uncle Harold used to call him Keith the Cat, because he'd landed on his feet instead of on his head when he fell off the water tower. We had Don and Maureen, Don Bowman and Maureen Lunt, who were recently married, a new married couple. Don Bowman was out of Mexico. His father was Claudius. Claudius was Uncle Harold's brother, one of the 5 Bowman brothers that stayed in Mexico. Mauricio was Don's little brother. So his father was Claudius. Mauricio was here at least 2 years. He's passed away now also. Let's see, some others that we had that were, of course, many of the Nixon family and the Bowman family worked here. They hired family members during the summer and a lot of their friends. Clarice Bowman was one of the gals. She was Thell's daughter, I think. That was another brother of Uncle Harold. So those are some important people, family members that have helped make Jacob Lake go. And they just are a few that come to mind at the moment. So those are some of the personnel. Now I want to tell you another story about when I was about 16 years old. I invited some of my friends to come down, to go down into the Grand Canyon. and there were 5 of us. There was Howard Galloway, Earl McKenna, Ray Nielsen, myself, and one other. And at that point, we were the tough guys around. We played on the football team, and we were in the track team, and we thought that we were in great shape. And I told them about taking a trip down through the Grand Canyon and what a fun time it would be. And so they came down, and along with my friends, I went with them, and we were going to go down to Phantom Ranch, down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then back out. We got a lot of groceries and stuff we put in our packs and started off. And by about 7 o'clock at night, it was starting to get a little bit dark, and we thought, why don't we do this? Let's make camp. We're right here by Roaring Springs, and there's a nice spring that came right out of the mountain, and there was an old table there that somebody had built. And so we said, let's not eat anything tonight because we'll need the nourishment in the morning. So we had a couple of cartons of milk, and we had a lot of items, bread and sweet rolls and other things that we had brought with us to eat before we walked out of the canyon the next day. And we went swimming that night in the Roaring Springs and had a fun time. Went to bed without eating any of the food we've had. And when we got up the next morning, every single thing that we had brought down there had been eaten by the squirrels and the chipmunks. The milk carton had been gnawed through, and it was kind of a wax exterior on it. And the squirrels had gnawed the milk carton, so the milk had run all over the floor, all over the ground, and where we had it sitting, the bread had all been eaten. The sweet rolls were, everything we had brought down to cook the next morning was gone, and we hadn't eaten anything, and we were hungry, and now we had to walk out of that canyon. And of course, the only thing we could do that was there to eat was watercress. We got some pretty good watercress out of the Roaring Springs, and there were little minnows in the spring, but no big fish. And we found an old piece of a gunny sack and drug the stream with this gunny sack, and we'd get a handful of minnows nearly every time we drag it. But the minnows were only about 1.5 inches long at the very most, and they were little tiny bodies. You couldn't clean them. And so we thought, well, we need the protein. We've got the watercress. We just boiled. We found an old pot, built a fire, and boiled the fish. And then here we all sat eating minnows and watercress because we were so hungry and all our food had been eaten. And then we started out to go back. Well, by the time that we got halfway back up the trail, that nourishment hadn't lasted very much from the watercress. And we were getting so tired that we could only go about 60 or 70 feet and have to stop again and sit down or lay down in the trail and rest. And then, pretty quick, we ran out of water. because we only had a couple or three canteens of water with us, and there was no springs to replenish the water on the trail back. So now we're running out of hydration, and we're running out of strength because we haven't eaten anything really good, and it was really getting difficult. And here's these tough guys taking our shirts off. Two or three of us had thrown our sleeping bag over the side because it got too heavy to carry. When the canteens got empty with water, we threw the canteens away because they were heavy to carry. And we were throwing all our stuff. Even one guy threw all the film that he'd taken of the pictures that we'd taken down there while we were doing this, simply because they were too heavy to carry. And we'd be able to go maybe 50 or 60 feet, and we'd just have to lay down the trail and just rest again. And here we were supposed to be the tough guys. Well, one time while we were laying there recovering, there was a big snake that I saw coming down off the side of the trail, down off the bank there. And it was kind of coming towards us. And I remember thinking, you know, I don't care if he crawls right over me. I'm too tired to move. And I thought, I'll never forget how tired I was to let a snake crawl over the top of me rather than have the strength to get up and move. And Howard Galloway, one of the guys, saw it too. And thank goodness he got up and got a long stick. And he hooked the stick underneath him and flipped him off the side of the trail down the other side. And so I didn't have to worry anymore. I just laid there because I was so tired. Anyway, interesting experience. Tough guys thinking they knew the world. They could take on anybody. Thought we were in perfect shape. Made a mistake and didn't eat the night before. We ran out of water coming back. By the time we finally made it to the top, there was a commissary there where you could buy food. And we went in and we got cans of peaches, and we got milk, and we got soda water, and we got all kinds of food, and just gorged ourselves. We just ate and ate and ate, and then we all got sick and started throwing up because we put all this food on these empty stomachs, and so we were sick again.